This is episode 5 of Discovering Classical Music, Dvorak's Ninth Symphony from the New World. And you'll have to forgive my pronunciation of Dvorak, I'm not Czech. Just quickly before we start, I wanted to let you know I've started a new Patreon page, and I've listened to your initial feedback, I've changed up the tiers, and I've made it into a monthly thing instead of a per episode thing. So if you want to help support this channel and this podcast, you can now do so more easily than ever. And doing so will get you access to a bunch of cool bonus things and community discussions. Most importantly, I really want to build a community of music lovers who are enjoying this journey together. We'll hold discussions, see behind-the-scenes footage, vote on what pieces or films I'm going to cover next, have Q&A sessions, and so on. So check it out at patreon.com/inside the score. These podcasts will always remain free, but I really appreciate the support in helping me to keep this channel alive. So now, I should mention that this episode will talk about some elements of Black history in the United States, particularly relating to the history of certain spirituals and gospel songs, and that's because this history is very much related to Dvorak's symphony. I'm aware that there's a popular modern discourse on cultural power dynamics, and I won't be talking about that here. There's a fascinating story to tell about how certain tunes have transmitted themselves across all sorts of cultural and racial barriers, and that's the story I want to tell. To me, it is not a story of power so much as a story of the strange way that music comes to mean different things to different communities over time. So, let's talk about this symphony. This work is a bit of a warhorse. It has a very strong reputation, is very famous, and it's a common request amongst you commenters out there. It's now catalogued as his Ninth Symphony, with the subtitle From the New World, though perhaps it's more commonly known as the New World Symphony. Dvorak was a famous Czech composer who lived between 1841 and 1904. In the 1890s, he moved to America to take on a teaching job at the National Conservatory in New York City. It was during his stay in America, around 1892 or 1893, that he wrote the New World Symphony. Dvorak's main ambition in America was to discover American music. He'd already used Czech folk idioms in his symphonic music back home, creating a distinctly Czech symphonic language. Now he wanted to do the same with American music. He was a big appreciator of African American and Native American music, and believed that that should be the foundation for a new American musical language. As Dvorak himself said, "I am convinced that the future music of this country must be founded on what are called negro melodies. These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them." You see, America, or at least the American symphonists, resented that they hadn't yet found their American musical language. Their music still sounded like a European musical style, and of all people, Dvorak took it upon himself to try and find their national style, the American musical voice, or at least he thought he might be able to kickstart the development of this American style. So, while at the conservatory, Dvorak taught an African-American student, Harry Burleigh, who later became Dvorak's assistant and family friend. Through this relationship, Dvorak was introduced to many Negro spirituals, which Burleigh would sing to him. The story, as I've heard it told many times, even on national radio, goes that Burleigh wrote a new spiritual, Goin Home, which we might recognize.
Just going home, quiet like some still day. I'm just going home.
And then Dvorak took that spiritual and put it into his symphony. However, I've read in other older books that this spiritual existed before Belay. The spiritual existed before Goin Home with a different text, Massa Dear, and this old text has since been almost entirely expunged from history for perhaps obvious reasons. If this spiritual did exist before Belay's version, it would fit nicely with the story that Dvorak travelled out in America, visiting plantations and listening to the workers' songs. He then used or adapted these tunes into his symphony. It's a popular story. The only problem is, it's all bollocks. Evidence has it that Dvorak did not travel outside of New York until after the symphony was first performed. Moreover, Goin Home was in fact not written by Belay and did not come before Dvorak's symphony. Rather, 30 years after Dvorak's symphony, in 1922, one of Dvorak's students, William Arms Fisher, wrote the words for Goin Home, setting it to Dvorak's tune. And it's the same story with the less fortunate words Massa Dear. Though some believed this was a true spiritual, the words were actually written by another of Dvorak's students, Harvey Worthington Loomis. So, the Dvorak tune came first, and then the spiritual. And yet, in a strange twist of American history, Goin Home seems to have become falsely canonized as an authentic Negro spiritual, and has since been regularly recorded by black performers in collections of spirituals. But if this melody by Dvorak wasn't inspired by a pre-existing spiritual, then where did it come from? Did Dvorak just make it up? Well, there is another story, a far less well-known one, but when you start to delve into it, it becomes even more fascinating. There's a famous gospel song known as Jesus, the Light of the World. If you've been to a gospel service more than once, you'll probably recognize the main tune.
Beautiful light, come where the
and this has become one of the most popular and well-loved songs in the gospel community. But curiously enough, this song was originally composed and copyrighted in 1890 by George D. Elderkin, a white composer of Methodist hymns. In its original form, this song had a verse to the text of Wesley's poem, Hark the Herald Angels Sing. In this case, it goes something like this.
Jesus, the light of the world. Glory to the newborn King. Jesus, the light of the world.
So, for reference, here's Dvorak's tune again. And now listen closer to the Elderkin hymn sung by a different performer, and you'll realize it's almost an exact replica of Dvorak's tune, harmonically and melodically.
Hark the herald say, Jesus, the light of the world. Glory to the newborn Jesus, the light.
So, 1890, when Jesus, the Light of the World was published, was just 2 years before Dvorak published his symphony. He could have easily found Elderkin's Book of Hymns in a Manhattan music store and absorbed the tune from there. So it seems that Dvorak didn't go walking around plantations for inspiration, as the story goes. Perhaps he simply found a book of Methodist hymn music near his New York apartment and used that as his inspiration for this tune. And if that's true, that presents a fascinating narrative of how this one musical tune has disseminated itself across multiple cultural and racial barriers. On one side, you have this American hymn, written in the 1890s by a white American composer, Elderkin, which has since been adopted and become well loved by the African American community as a popular gospel song.
Beautiful light, come where.
Then you have Dvorak, a European Czech composer who came to America and adapted this song for his symphony, which was an attempt at creating an American symphonic musical language. And then, following this symphony, the Dvorak version was turned into an actual spiritual, known now as Goin Home.
Going home, going home, I'm just going home.
And for probably about a century now, this spiritual has somehow been largely accepted as part of the canon of Negro spiritual music. What's crazy is that both Jesus the Light of the World and Goin Home are still often performed today, and yet very few people realize that they're brother and sister. It's the same tune, only remorphed along the way by a European symphonic composer. And I think that's an extraordinary testament to the way a cultural idea can travel across different mediums, coming to mean different things for different cultural groups. It reminds us of just how much America is built on a mixed cultural heritage. So anyway, aside from that fascinating history of this tune, it is quite possible that Dvorak was influenced by other spirituals, indigenous music, and American folk music. Certainly his relationship with Harry Bolet had a big influence on him, and Dvorak had huge admiration for this music. So many of the tunes in this symphony really sound folky, including the one we've just heard. And this one too. Why do they sound folky? Well, one simple answer is because they're using the pentatonic scale. That's a scale of 5 notes, hence pentatonic. And these notes are 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1. The pentatonic scale is used in folk music all over the world, not just America, China, all across Europe, and this is because they're the most fundamental notes of the overtone series. These notes together sound very consonant and very free of any harmonic tension. So this melody of Dvorak is pentatonic. And so is this one. And so it sounds folky. And this leads me on to my final point before we go into our musical walkthrough. Many people say that Dvorak discovered the American symphonic musical voice, that this symphony just sounds American. And I personally don't think that's quite right. Sure, he probably kick-started the hunt for a genuine American musical voice, and his folk tunes are beautiful and might exhibit some qualities of American folk music. They certainly have a great soulfulness about them. But the fact is, when he isn't quoting folky material, his music falls back on the Czech, Germanic musical style that he'd spent his whole life perfecting. This isn't true American music. This is Czech music, infused with the songs and folk music he heard in America. I think true American symphonic music came later. America did find its own true musical voice, and that voice came from jazz. And when composers such as Copland came along and absorbed the harmonic, rhythmic, melodic language of jazz into his symphonic music, then we had a classical style which we could truly call American and not European. There's a fantastic essay on this by Leonard Bernstein. It's actually his PhD thesis for Harvard, I think, and it's in his book Findings. It's well worth reading if you're interested in how the American symphonic style developed from jazz, and perhaps that's a topic for another episode. So let's get on with the music. And remember, listening to this podcast is a great start, but you really gotta go away afterwards and listen to the piece yourself. Turn off your phone, turn off your distractions, either go see it live or just listen to a great recording of it. And I'll talk about recordings at the end of this podcast, but it really makes all the difference to really enjoy the full impact of this piece as a true symphonic experience. First, movement 1, which is in sonata form. Again, if you want to learn anything about the forms or structures of classical music, check out the video series How to Listen to Classical Music on my YouTube channel, Inside the Score. The movement begins with a slow introduction, a melancholy opening theme. Which speaks for itself, really. But then there are these dramatic interruptions. This surging figure comes, and after some great tension, it eventually takes the shape of the main theme of the first movement in E minor. This theme is really in two parts, the first part and the second part. Once the whole orchestra has taken this up, the second part of this theme develops into a transition-like passage. And then hints at a new theme to come. And this all leads to the second subject. The second subject has two main themes, one in G minor, but a folky modal G minor with a flattened seventh. And this theme is treated as folky, with a bare fifth pulse in the cello accompanying the theme. And this leads to a wonderful passage of transformation. And more exploration gradually leads us to calmer territories in G major, where we get our second theme, which many have suggested resembles the music of spirituals or old American folk songs, perhaps. And in the climax of the exposition, it bursts out at full volume in the basses. So anyway, the exposition should repeat itself, which is what was normal in sonata form. And then after the exposition, the development starts by quickly moving to a foreign key area, and then exploring and traveling through many keys, which is normal for development sections. And the development is largely based on this second subject theme. And also the second part of the main theme. And then also the first part of the main theme. So really, he's playing with pretty much all the material from the exposition, but it certainly makes for exciting thematic and tonal drama. But surprisingly, there's not a huge climactic dominant pedal leading into the recapitulation like you'd get with many composers or many pieces that I've covered on this podcast. Dvorak keeps this one pretty tame, but it's been a very enjoyable journey to get there. So when the recap comes, it starts off the same as the exposition. But when he goes bigger, he decides to divert off into a foreign key. leading him to a surprising G-sharp minor for his second subject, which is a semitone higher than where we would have been in the exposition, G minor. And from here, he recapitulates all of the second subject. But why has he gone to such an awkwardly distant key? Well, by going this far away from the home key, it now necessitates Dvorak to do something particularly dramatic or clever to bring us back to the home key, E minor. And indeed, he makes use of this opportunity. And that brings about the fantastic coda with all kinds of drama. You hear the main theme and the first theme of the second subject in a kind of combination. And then E minor is restored in a climax of tragic fury, bringing the movement to an end. Now on to movement 2, the slow movement, which we talked about a bit earlier. Like many composers before him, Dvorak has decided to put his slow movement into quite a remote key. Whereas the first movement was in E minor, he wants this one to be in D flat major. That's a pretty distant key, tonally speaking. However, where others would be happy to just immediately restart in D flat, Dvorak wants to smoothly bridge the gap between E and D flat. How's he going to do that? Well, here's his ingenious answer. And these glorious harmonies usher in the spiritual song, which we talked about in the beginning of the podcast, played here beautifully on the cor anglais. This movement just has a wonderful feeling of relaxed peacefulness, and it goes on beautifully for a while. But eventually, that melody dies away into a plaintive episode in the minor key. This episode is a bit more unsettled, emotionally driven. It's not the calm course we were on, but it has no real power to sway us from that course, though it certainly has more dynamic range than our first spiritual theme. This middle episode goes on for a while, exploring different musical ideas, meandering, pondering on something. But it also has its more helpless, more impassioned moments. And it refracts for a while between these calmer ideas and this more emotional agitation, until finally it reaches this very cool harmonic trick with the emotional melody over the top. Then, out of nowhere, these dancing figures appear, a kind of folky figure again. It soon fills the orchestra, growing with tension. until our main theme from the first movement bursts out menacingly, accompanied by the second theme from the first movement. This eventually simmers down into our spiritual again, and the whole melody plays. There's these most gorgeous pauses written in, which I've heard live done in a way which brings shivers to the spine. And the melody slowly dies away into nothing. This leads to our mysterious opening chords again, and the movement ends on a sensitive pianissimo chord written for 4 double basses. Movement 3 is a scherzo. It begins with this startling introduction, sort of quoting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but it quickly settles into a very cool minor 7th harmonic territory to set everything in motion. And that starts off our characteristic scherzo theme. I'll play it again, and you'll notice it's a canon of sorts. The flute and the oboe are mimicked by the clarinet afterwards. And then the theme goes off brilliantly with the strings, leading to this thick spiccato figure. And finally to a full orchestral statement with descending chromatic brass. And then that transitions into an interlude. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this is the trio section of our scherzo trio form, but it's not. It's just an interlude in our scherzo. And gradually it leads in a clever way back to our main scherzo theme. So that goes on, and then Dvorak has to bring about the real trio section. How's he going to do that? Well, he brings about the main theme from the first movement again, or we might as well say at this point, the main theme of the whole symphony. And this leads to our playful trio music, a bit more dance-like, I think. And it's answered with more bravura string figures, which remind me of an old Viennese waltz. And then, as is typical in scherzo form, when the trio's over, the scherzo returns and runs its course to the end of the movement. Except, as it's ending, we get this coda, starting like this. Yes, he's bringing the symphony's main theme again. And finally, it settles on a major key. No, wait, a minor key. Right? Finally, there's movement 4, the finale in sonata form. And the more and more I listen to the first 9 bars, the less and less it sounds like Jaws by John Williams. I kind of despair when people say John Williams copied his theme for Jaws from this. It's 2 notes, and the way each composer treats them is completely different. Dvorak's is much more stormy. Anyway, the main theme is this powerful, epic theme. After several versions of that, we get this kind of more active triplet figure, helping us to transition away from that first theme. until we get a very contrasting second theme. And this grows into a more impassioned answer on the strings. Which turns into a kind of third theme for the exposition. And after some playfulness, this settles down for our development section, which, as ever, will move through several keys, playing with all the material he set up in the exposition. But actually, that's not really enough for Dvorak in this case, his final symphony. As well as quoting the themes he set up in the finale, he starts to quote other themes too. And actually, if you listen to the violin underneath that, it's sneakily quoting the main theme of the scherzo too. This all goes quite big with the spiritual music, and a bit darker too. And then the development keeps moving through key areas until we hear the symphony's main theme again, always a significant herald. In this case, it's leading to a climax on the finale's main theme. Which leads to our recapitulation. Only now the main theme is over a dominant pedal and feels more defeated, more exhausted, not the powerful statement it was in the beginning. And so it becomes something slower, more resigned. And that starts to move through strange key areas, leading to a sentimental recap of the finale's second theme. And then a calm recap of the finale's third theme in the winds. And towards the end of this recapitulation, we get a hint of the symphony's main theme again, in horn. But again, this is a herald of violence to come. And the finale bursts out furiously in E minor again. And then we get this epic statement of the symphony's main theme, with a descending cry answering in the strings. There's a lot of aggression. And what's really cool is, remember those mysterious chords from the beginning of the slow movement? Well, they come back here, slightly altered, and now with a vengeance. then it all simmers down. And as it simmers, we get sad, fatigued, defeated hints of the themes. The spiritual in a minor key, and again, the main theme of the scherzo is being hinted at and thrown around the orchestra. Listen again. And that leads to a resigned repeat of the finale's main theme. Is it all over? Well, not quite. Oh, that's satisfying. And we get that finale theme combined with the symphony's main theme over some great harmonies. And finally, the symphony draws to a close, with a curious effect. The last chord is hammered down, as you might expect, but then held, and it diminuendos to a pianissimo. My favourite recordings for Dvorak symphonies are by the Hungarian conductor István Kertész. Again, forgive my pronunciation. That's Kertesz, or Z for Americans, and he's conducting the London Symphony Orchestra. However, for some reason, I wasn't feeling Kertész this week. There is another great modern performance by Andris Nelsons, bless that giant of a conductor. He's conducting the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra. That's the recording I went with this week. Isn't it great that there are so many recordings to choose from? If you're not feeling a certain performance one week, you can just try another. I think most of Andris Nelson's recordings are brilliant contemporary performances, and this one is no exception. Also, I remember as an adolescent loving Herbert von Karajan conducting this piece with the Vienna Philharmonic. As with almost all of Karajan's recordings, it has this relentless, incredible energy. Everything of the Romantic period that Karajan touches somehow becomes more significant, weighty, and meaningful. So thank you so much for listening. As I say, you can support this podcast and channel by becoming part of the community. Join in with discussions, poll voting, behind the scenes, early access, and more by visiting my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/inside the score. It will really help me to keep putting out more good content. So thank you for your support. If you can, then please do subscribe, share with your friends, like this podcast, and thanks very much for listening.